suspected and labeled in the petition. The tagging and attacks don't stop. In fact, they have escalated. With the implementation of the Anti-Terrorism Act, our organizations, communities, family, and we, activists, are further endangered. Recently, in Sagada, in my very own hometown, the police, in a public meeting that later on turned to be an activity of the LCAC, the task force to eliminate communist armed conflict, stated that the people should be wary of me and my sister because we are NPA recruiters. A month earlier, the PNP regional office, in a press conference, made the same statement and presented alleged NPA surrenderies to support these false accusations. I am the International Solidarity Officer of Katribu, the National Alliance of Indigenous Peoples Organizations in the Philippines, and the Global Coordinator of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. Since our founding, our organizations have been working for the recognition of indigenous people's rights to ancestral lands and territories. Allow me also to share the experience of a close colleague and friend who is not able to join us here, Lumad leader Dato Jomorito Jomong Guainon. He is the Kalumbay Lumad Organization chairperson and one of a few who was charged with terrorism under the old Human Security Act. Police and military officers illegally arrested him on January 28, 2019, and later in May of the same year, he was charged for violating the Human Security Act. But the court dismissed the case for lack of merit, along with charges of attempted and frustrated murder, illegal possession of firearms and explosives, and rebellion. Dato Jumong, however, remains detained for other trump-up charges of kidnapping, robbery, and arson. Like many of us here, prior to his arrest, he was red-tagged, publicly accused of being a top leader of the NPA and the terrorists. And of course, we should, if we remember, much earlier, police arrested Edgar Candule. He is an Aita from Botolan, Zambales, on suspicion of being an NPA. He was also later charged with illegal possession of firearms and violation of the Human Security Act. The court acquitted and released Edgar after 3 years of detention. Aside from criminalization and trump-up charges, many of our colleagues, many of our comrades have been extrajudicially killed and forcibly disappeared. Our cases that you'll hear today cannot overemphasize the terror law's danger to our safety and security. Last point, calling us terrorists or criminals are malicious and irresponsible accusations, as these tags suggest that we are not reputable members of society and intend to alienate us from our community. It discredits our struggles' legitimacy and undermines our right to self-determination, to participate and voice our opinion in matters that affect us. The terror law is added ammunition to the existing arsenal of repressive laws against the indigenous and Moro peoples. It is a mockery to the exercise of fundamental rights and freedoms with the Philippine government's democratic governance and human rights obligations. We ask the Supreme Court to give utmost consideration to our petition and heed our prayer to declare the Anti-Terror Act of 2020 unconstitutional. We are activists. We are not terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bev. And at this point, I'd like to welcome Samira Gutok, who is the chairperson of ACOBAQUIT from Malawi, Mindanao. Ms. Samira.
Magandang hapon po. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ako po ay nagpapasalamat po sa legal representatives namin. Very grateful po sa pagtindig para sa aming mga nasa probinsya na hindi po pwede mag-travel po by flight dyan po sa Metro Manila. Ang anti-terror law ay hindi po nakakatulong violative even of the peace agreement that we have entered into as a government to the people of the Bangsamoro. This is not contributive to healing. Ito po ay ang hindi nakakatulong sa centuries-old stereotypes, derogatory words that label Muslims as terrorists in headlines. Hindi po natin nabibigyan po ng reconciliation na kinakailangan po. Ang ating pong destruction of three martial laws from air, land, sea, artillery ay hindi pa po nakaka-recover ang Marawi siege from a so-called anti-terror operation. Hindi pa po nakaka-recover ang napakaraming mga tribal communities who are outside of the barn, outside of Mindanao, trying to find a way to get out of being stranded at nawala na ng kanilang trabaho at pagiging sa pwesto nila dyan sa Metro Manila markets at kung saan-saan sa sulok ng Pilipinas. Hindi po nakakatulong ang anti-terror law sa isang komunidad na multiply discriminated. Ang kanilang identity, hindi lang identity, kundi paniniwala. Mismo pag nakakover ang mukha, nakanikab, o kaya makita ang pangalan Muhammad, ay extra check-up po sa kanyang sasakyan, o kaya nakaka-justify po ng warrantless raid, profiling, warrantless search, at extra pagtitingin sa kanyang ID at hindi pinapasakay sa mga sasakyan na publiko. Ito po ang ilang eksperyensya natin sa HSA Human Security Act of 2007 na ang pinakamalaking target po ay ang Bangsamoro Muslim communities. We urge that instead, the push for transitional justice mechanisms be put in place. We also take note that as of the implementation of the Human Security Act 2007, wala po man lang isang investigasyon sa mga mistaken arrests, mistaken identities. Sa pagkakamali ng otoridad, wala po accounting oversight. Wala po FYI ni isang Islamic Information Center ngayon sa Metro Manila dahil lahat na po na closure dahil sa pananakot at pagpasok ng seguridad sa kanila, wala na tayong makuhanan ng information about Islamic studies dito sa mga privately run Islamic centers in Metro Manila dahil sa itong pag-oopera sa kanila. Ito po ay mga ilang insidente na hindi pa po nabibigyan ng hustisya. And therefore, we are one of the primary stakeholders na tinatarget at matatarget at kailangan tumindig para sa mga countless war-ravaged victims, migrant communities, vendor communities, mga ilang mga communities na po na always ang brand ng all-terror war is an all-out war. An anti-terror war is an all-out war on a community. And therefore, we echo the Bangsamoro government's resolution that this anti-terror law should be rechecked, should involve them. In case may implementa, ang IRR dapat makonsulta ang mga komunidad concerned. With this, we submit to the Supreme Court our position through the petition that has been filed, and we hope the Supreme Court, in its glorious, majestic role as the supreme authority of the land, will favor the weak and the vulnerable who have no legal literacy and legal defense and arsenal behind them in their communities, except for the few lawyers na nagtitinig para sa atin. Magandang hapon po. Wassalamualaikum.
Maraming salamat, Samira. Sa punto pong ito, ang susunod po nating tagapagsalita ay si Ms. Joanna K. Carino. Siya po ay co-chair ng Sandugo or ang Alliance ng Moro and Indigenous Peoples for Self-Determination. Ma'am Carino.
Joanna Carino of the Cordillera People's Alliance and co-chair of Sandugo, the movement of Moro and Indigenous Peoples for Self-Determination. I am among the petitioners against the Anti-Terrorism Law, as it will only lead to greater suppression of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the indigenous and Moro peoples, already minoritized sections of our population. I was included in a long list of names that the Philippine government wanted to declare as terrorists. in their petition to proscribe the Communist Party of the Philippines and New People's Army as terrorist organizations. I have been an indigenous people's human rights defender in the public eye practically my whole life. I am hardly a terrorist. In fact, it is ironic that I was awarded the prestigious International Gwangju Prize for Human Rights in 2019, while this government would like to declare me as a terrorist. My primary organization, the Cordillera People's Alliance, has been under constant attack from the Duterte regime. 7 of our former and present leaders were listed as terrorists in the DOJ petition. The red tagging has been particularly vicious in social media during this COVID-19 pandemic, when government's attention should instead be on mitigating the health disaster and the economic crisis that has resulted. Official AFP and PNP Facebook accounts, aside from numerous troll accounts, have maliciously targeted CPA chairperson Wendell Bulingat, who is also among our petitioners, and other CPA personalities. Worse, they have included photos of his whole family, even his wife and son, who is still a minor in high school, in the threatening posts. This has led to serious threats to the security, not only of Wendell, but of the whole family, and to a significantly high level of stress that has to be endured by the family and by our whole organization. I have not been spared from these attacks against CPA on social media. Worse, even my lineage has been put under malicious scrutiny and defamation. I am the proud granddaughter of Mateo Carino, great-granddaughter of Mateo Carino, Ibaloy chieftain who fought and won the case for indigenous people's ancestral land rights in the historic case Carino versus insular government during the American colonial period, which is also referred to in our petition. The Carino doctrine of native title was groundbreaking jurisprudence used by indigenous peoples worldwide and was among the foundations for the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. For this, and for the support of Mateo of the revolution in the Filipino-American War, Mateo Carino has been recognized as a Philippine hero with a statue among other Philippine heroes in the Rizal Park. He surely does not deserve to be maligned because his great-granddaughter is being attacked as a terrorist. I joined the other petitioners, my organizations, Cordillera People's Alliance and Sandugo, Movement of Indigenous and Moro Peoples for Self-Determination, as we petition the Supreme Court to scrap the oppressive anti-terrorism law as unconstitutional. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Joanna. Representing the Moro Christian People's Alliance, we'd like to call on Amira Lidasan. Amira also has an op-ed with Davao Today, Voices of the Moro Masses. Amira?
Assalamualaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Kami po sa Moro Christian People's Alliance at ibang mga organisasyon na kaalyado nito ay kasama po sa mga petitioners na nagsampa ng petisyon upang ibasura ang Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 dahil po ito po ay muling magbubunsod ng maraming kaso ng human rights violation o paglabag sa karapatang pantao ng mga kapatid ninyong Moro at saka ng mga katutubo. Magdudulot din ito ng kapahamakan sa maraming bilang ng mamamayan. Sa karanasan po, alam natin na ang gobyerno ng Pilipinas ay hindi naging mabait sa mga kapatid Moro at katutubo. Ang ating pakikibaka, ang ating identidad, ang ating pakikibaka para sa sariling pagpapasya ay tinuturing na krimen at ngayon nga ay isang forma ng terorismo. Kung kaya't marami sa bilang ng mga kababayan natin, lalo na yung mga mahihirap, yung mga walang kakayanan na ipaglaban ng kanilang mga sarili, ay sapilitang mga pinalaya sa kanilang komunidad, pinag-aaresto. Sabi nga kanina ng kapatid nating si Samira Gutok, mistaken identity dahil ang mga pangalan nila ay maaaring kapangalan ng alias, kapangalan ng mga tinuturing na mga terorista. Idinitain ng mahabang panahon ng walang mga hearing o kaso. Tinorture, pinagkakitaan pa doon sa US Rewards for Justice Program. At pinaratangan silang mga terorista, Abu Sayyaf, ISIS. No? At magpasa hanggat sa ngayon, karakhan sa kanila ay nakakulong pa rin doon sa Camp Bagong Diwa. Ang iba naman ay nasintensyahan na at nandoon na sa National Bilibid. Maraming bilang din ng mga kababayan natin na mga Moro, sibilyang Moro ang sapilitang napalikas sa kanilang mga komunidad. Kasi ang mga military operation na gumagamit ng mga eroplano at saka ng mga helicopters, no, military airstrikes, ang binubomba ang aming mga komunidad at sinasabing parte daw ito ng hot pursuit operations sa mga sinasabing mga terrorist groups. Maraming bata ang mga napatay dahil sa mga military airstrikes na ito. At ang nakakagalit po, walang nananagot ng mga sundalo, ng mga opisyal, na gobyerno, na presidente sa lahat ng mga ikinaso po namin na paglabag sa mga karapatang pantao sa mga mamayang Moro at mga katutubo. Kahit po kami ng mga human rights defenders or mga Moro rights defenders at IP rights defenders ay nalalagay na rin po sa panganib ang aming buhay. Nandiyan po na ang mga mukha natin, pangalan natin, organisasyon natin ay pinapaskil nila sa mga poste sa lansangan, sa kanilang mga social media at pinaparatangan po tayo ng National Task Force, LCAC at saka ng AFP, no, ng mga terrorist recruiter. No, na isa pong bagay na nakakapagpabigay vulnerable sa ating sitwasyon, sa ating trabaho bilang mga human rights defenders. No. Nariyan din po ang mataas po ang bilang ng mga paglabag sa karapatang pantao dulot po ng mga anti-terror campaign ng gobyerno na ito. Mula po noong US Global War on Terror, nung paglabas po ng Human Security Act of 2007, marami po ang mga nailista natin at nai-submit na rin po natin sa mga human rights organization at sa UN na mga kaso sa paglabag sa karapatang pantao. Sa Anti-Terror Act of 2020, mas lalo pong dadami ito, mas tataas po ang bilang ng paglabag sa karapatang pantao at lalo na pinalawak po ng batas na ito ang konsepto ng terorismo, ng inciting to terrorism, ng Terrorist Act at lalo na po na tinanggal ang lahat ng mga safeguards, no, para po sa pagrespeto sa karapatan po ng mga biktima. Panawagan po namin bilang mamayang Moro ay ibasura ang Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, ipaglaban ang karapatan ng mamayang Moro at mga katutubo, ipaglaban ang karapatan ng mamamayang Pilipino. Maraming salamat po. Wassalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum. Maraming salamat, Amira. Ang susunod po nating tagapagsalita ay si Francisca Kakay Tolentino. Siya po ang National Coordinator at Spokesperson ng By Indigenous Women's Network in the Philippines. Kakay?
Makatarungang araw sa ating lahat. Ako si Francisca Tolentino, isang katutubong dumagat mula sa bundok ng Sierra Madre. Isa ring National Coordinator ng By Indigenous Women's Network at membro ng Pambansang Konseho ng mga katutubo ng katribo Kalipunan ng Katutubong Mamayan sa Pilipinas. Isa rin ako sa petitioners na nanawagang ibasura o ipawalang bisa ang Anti-Terrorism Act 2020 dahil ito ay sadyang mapanupil, marahas na batas na tuwirang lalabag sa aming demokratikong karapatan at higit pa sa aming pagpapasya sa sarili bilang mga babae at bilang mga katutubo. Wala pa man ang Anti-Terrorism Law, ang mga lider kababaihang katutubo ng aming organisasyong Bayi Indigenous Women's Network ay humaharap na sa maraming kaso ng red tagging bilang mga terorista, NPA supporter at iba pa. Ang aming malakas na boses ng pagtatanggol sa lupang ninuno laban sa pandarambong, ang paggigiit sa aming mga socio-economic na mga karapatan ay ginagawang krimen ng gobyerno. Tinuturing kaming mga kriminal sa pagpataw ng mga trump-up charges na humahantong sa pag-aresto, pagkukulong at masahol pa ay humahantong sa extrajudicial killings. Nais kong ibahagi ang ilang mga tampok na kaso. Kriminalisasyon at trump-up charges. Narito po sa aking kaliwa ang larawan ni Julita Tulino, isang manobo, Dulangan Manobo, isang teacher o guro ng Center for Lumad Advocacy Networking and Services Incorporated o CLANS sa sitio Tinagdanan, Barangay Hinalaan, Kalamansig, Sultan Kudarat. Si Teacher Julita ay pinaratangang kasapi ng New People's Army, inaresto at kinulong sa trump-up charge na frustrated murder. Sa aking kanan naman po ay larawan ni Gloria Tumalon, isang manobot mula sa Jatagon, Lianga, Surigao del Sur. Si Gloria ay leader kababaihan na nagtatanggol sa kalikasan at tumitindig laban sa pagpasok ng 5 kumpanyang ng pagmimina sa kanilang lupain sa Andap Valley Complex. Noong Marso 19, 2020, sa gitna ng pandemya, si Gloria ay inaresto at kasalukuyang nakadetine sa sinampang kaso ng kidnapping at serious illegal detention. Nagpapatuloy na red tagging at vilifications. Tumitindi ang red tagging sa mga organisasyong katutubong kababaihan, mga lider at mamayan ng mga katutubong nagdidepensa sa aming mga lupang ninuno sa pamumuno ng National Task Force at LCAP at lalo pa itong lalala dahil sa Anti-Terrorism Act na magliligalisa sa panunupil at pasistang atake ng LCAP. Mga miyembro ng PNP, AAP at mga CAFGU at paramilitary groups na may direktang ugnay sa AFP. Ilan sa mga kaso ng pagpapatuloy ng red tagging ang mga sumusunod. Si Teacher Ludema o Teacher Diday kung tawagin namin, Ludema Doreteo, isang dumagat at guro ng elementarya sa sitio Nayon, Santa Ines, Tanay, Rizal, ay pinaparatangang suporter at kuryer ng NPA. Nakakaranas siya at ang kanyang pamilya at malapit na kaanak ng mga harassment at paninindak. Gayon din ang mga miyembro ng kanilang komunidad ng harassment, pamimilit o coercion. Noong February 8, 2020, pilit silang pinapapirma ng Charlie Company 80 IB, second ID, sa isang ready-made na kasulatan na nagsasaad na sila ay walang natatamong paglabag mula sa mga military at sila ay sang-ayon sa pagtatayo ng military detachment sa kanilang lugar. Mayo 25, 2020, nakatanggap ang mamayang dumagat sa sitio Nayon at Kinabuan, Barangay Santa Ines, ng sulat na pupulungin ang mga tao kasama ang nakalista na 37 na pangalan na tinutukoy nilang taga-suporta, nagpapatuloy at nagpapakain ng mga NPA. Isa pang kaso, noong May 13, 2020, ang aming leader sa Cagayan Valley na si Maripel Macalandia, Regional Coordinator at Staff ng Punganay IP Organization sa Cagayan Valley, ay pinaparatangan ng mga opisyales ng barangay sa San Mariano, Lalo, Cagayan Province na membro ng NPA at noong May 21, nakitang nakakalat sa harap ng opisina ng Punganay ang mga pulyeto kung saan may larawan, si Mafel at iba pang miyembro ng mga sektoral na organisasyon na nagsasaad na sila ay mga leader at recruiter ng NPA. Nagpakalat din ang mga military ng katulad na pulyeto sa bayan ng Bagao, Cagayan Province. Ang mga lumad leader at kabataang leader katutubo sa ilalim ng Sabukahan, Unity of Indigenous Women in Southern Mindanao, si Bai Lorena Bayao, chairperson ng Sabukahan at isa ding petitioner, at ang kanyang anak na leader kabataan si Rory Limbayao, isang Sabukahan Youth Coordinator na taga-Talaingod, Davao del Norte, ay pinaparatangang sila ay mga NPA na nagsasalita sa mga forum at rally dito sa Kamaynilaan at may tarpaulin na nakalagay ang kanilang mga pangalan at picture na may nakasulat na terorista kasapi ng NPA na nakakabit sa ilang lugar sa bayan ng Talaingod. Sila ay mga biktima ng militarisasyon sa kanilang komunidad at eskwelahang lumad. Si Bai Lorena ay presidente ng Parents, Teachers and Students Association ng Salugpungan at si Rorilyn ay bilang estudyante. Ang Inabuyog, Alliance of Indigenous Women's Organization in the Cordillera, ay nakakaranas ng masahol na pagpaparatang, vilified and red tag simula nang ipatupad ang Executive Order Number 70, the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police, at binabansagan bilang front organization of the Communist Terrorist Groups or CTGs. Ang mga prominenteng leader at membro sa lokalidad ay pinaparatangan ding mga supporter at membro ng CTGs. Sa ngayon, sa gitna ng pandemya, maging ang inisyatiba ng aming mga organisasyong kababaihang katutubo, mga leader at membro na pagtutulungan para tugunan ang kakulangan ng gobyerno sa pagbibigay ng ayuda at pagbibigay ng batayang impormasyon hinggil sa COVID-19 at paano maiwasan ang pagkalat nito ay walang pakundangan ding pinaparatangan ng mga military at pulis na gawa ito ng mga terorista. Imbes tulungan, alalayan ang mga katutubo sa kanilang humanitarian services na ginagawa. Marami pang paglabag at pagpaparatang sa mga kababaihang katutubong leader at membro sa kanilang organisasyon tulad sa Kaisahan ng Kababaihang Katutubo sa Gitnang Luzon, ang Anggoy sa mga tumandok sa Panay Island, Kasalo at Mapaso sa Caraga, Madagway sa Northern Mindanao, Nakasa sa Sarangani Province, nang lahat ng ito ay kaanib at membro ng Bayi Indigenous Women's Network dahil sa pagtitiyak sa kabuhayan, edukasyon ng aming mga pamilya at komunidad, mga kababaihang katutubo na nagsasalita at tumitindig para igiit ang aming mga batayang karapatan bilang mamamayan at babaeng katutubos, karapatan sa lupa, kabuhayan, rekurso at karapatan sa sariling pagpapasya. Yeah, nawala.
Okay. Meron pa po, Tekay?
Panghuli na lang, nawawala yung papel ko.
Sige, sige.
Sa ganitong kaganapan o insidente na kinakaharap ng mga kababaihang katutubo sa ilalim ng Bayi Indigenous Women's Network, ay nananatili kaming naninindigan na kung saan ang Anti-Terrorism Act na ito ay aming paninindigan at lalabanan dahil hindi lamang ang aming batayang karapatan bilang mamamayan ang lalabagin, bagkus ang lalabagin nito ay ang aming karapatan bilang mga kababaihang katutubo sa lupa, rekurso at sariling pagpapasya. Kaya't ang aming panawagan ay tutulan, ibasura ang Anti-Terrorism Act na kung saan nananawagan kami sa lahat ng mga hurado sa Supreme Court na matuwiran at wastong suriin ang batas na ito hanggang sa humantong sa kanilang pagdidesisyon na maibasura ang marahas, mapanupil na Anti-Terrorism Act. Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat, Kakay, doon sa malawak na paglalarawan ng kalagayan ng ating mga kasamang katutubong kababaihan. Kanina po ay nandito po si Ate Teresa, siya po ay isang Aita Abalen. Tinitignan ko ngayon, mukhang bumitaw na naman ang kanyang signal, no? Ito ay isa sa pagpapakita kung gaano na lang kahirap no access to justice ng ating mga kasamang katutubo. Access to internet connection man lang para maipakita at maipadulog sa atin ang kanilang mga sitwasyon on the ground ay hirap na. Mabuti na lamang po kasama natin sa hapong ito ang isa sa ating petitioner, si Judith Pamela Pasinio, na ang tawag namin ay Judy. Siya ay National Coordinator ng LILAC o Purple Action for Indigenous Women. So tinatawagan ko po si Judy.
Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Sayang at wala na si Teresa de la Cruz, isa sa ating petitioners na isang Aita Abelen, para makapagpahayag. Pero ang LILAC ay kasama ni na Ate Teresa at ang isa pang petitioners na si Nora Sukal, isang blaan mula sa Tampakan naman. At tulad ng sinabi mo, ay hindi sila makakadalo dito. Pero itong araw na ito ay tinuturing namin na isang historic day, isang makasaysayang araw. Dahil ang indigenous women stood up to this government and said no. Ayaw na namin sa patuloy na pananakot sa aming mga nagtutulak ng karapatan, mga nagtatanggol sa karapatan, sa lupaing ninuno, pangisdaan, kagubatan. They stood up to this misogynist, militarist, and violent government. Malaki ang mga pangamba ng mga katutubong kababaihan. Nung nagkukwentuhan kami at nagdesisyong mag-file dito ng petitions, nangangamba sila kasi these are the indigenous women who are in the front lines in the defense of their land. Mga nasa unahan sila ng pagtatanggol ng kanilang pinagkukuhaan ng pagkain at ng mga kabuhayan. Mabigat ang dagdag na pangambang ito ngayon sa panahon ng pandemya. Itong batas na ito, the Anti-Terror Act, was railroaded, niratsyada sa panahon ng pandemya. A law that would neither combat COVID-19 or improve the situation of millions of Filipinos who are affected by COVID-19 and the lockdown policies. Dapang-dapa ang maraming indigenous women partners ng LILAC dahil sa tagtuyot, hindi magandang ani, wala silang pagkain sa panahon ng lockdown. At yung mga may naani, hindi naman maibenta ang mga produkto dahil nga sa lockdown. At ngayon, ang tugon ng pamahalaan ay ang pagbubukas pa ng mga malawakang minahan, sabi ng DNR, for economic recovery. Ayon din sa DA o Department of Agriculture na pumasok sa isang joint special order with NCIP or National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, ibubukas ang mga idle lands daw ng ancestral domains, idle parts of the ancestral domains para sa food production. Alam natin anong ibig sabihin ng food production sa gobyernong ito. Ang ibig sabihin nito ay malawakang mga plantasyon o mga produksyon na ang mga korporasyon ang siyang mamamahala at makikinabang. This would mean more land grabbing and land conflicts among indigenous peoples and between indigenous peoples and the corporations. More attacks against ancestral lands and ancestral domains. And of course, sabi nga ni Kakay, ni Nabeb at ng iba pang mga nagsalita kanina, hindi hinto ang mga katutubong kababaihan sa kanilang pakikipaglaban para sa kanilang pamilya, para sa kanilang komunidad. At kami bilang LILAC, isang organisasyon na nagtutulak rin at sumusuporta bilang kababaihan sa indigenous women's struggle, ay narito para ipagpatuloy ang laban sa minahan, laban sa mga korporasyon. Anong koneksyon ng anti-terror law? Dahil ito ang tinuturing na terorismo ng pamahalang ito. Ang pagtindig at pagtayo laban sa mga ganid ng mga korporasyon at laban sa mga extractive government development projects. According to the UN Human Rights Report, 248 activists were killed from 2015 to 2019. Global Witness tagged the Philippines the most dangerous country for environment and land rights defenders 2 years in a row. They counted 133 killings during Duterte's presidency. 46% of cases are believed to have been perpetrated by the armed forces of the Philippines. 44% occurred in Mindanao, and 22% of the victims were indigenous peoples. A large percentage of the killings were related to land grabbing of agribusinesses, plantations, and mining companies and state-sponsored development projects such as mega dams and power plants. These are from killings which were reported. There are more acts of violence and killings within ancestral domains which are not officially documented and reported. Kaya sabi rin ni Kakay kanina, even during the pandemya, grabe rin ang pag-vilify ng mga kilos na pakikipag-bayanihan sa mga kapwa indigenous communities na nangangailangan. Yung mga partners namin sa ang isa ay sa Mamanwa, Agusan del Norte, inikutan ng 4 na military trucks ang kanilang barangay. Hinahanap yung leader na partner namin at sabi ay ikaw ay nagpapakain sa mga NPA dahil nagdala ka ng mga ayuda sa iba't ibang bahagi ng kabundukan. Ang sagot niya, yun yung mga hindi naaabot ng gobyerno o ayaw abutin ng gobyerno dahil mahirap. Kaya kami ang umaakit doon para magpakain, para magbigay ng tulong. Ito ang mga tinuturing na acts of terrorism ng pamahalang ito. Kaya historic day din ang araw na ito. Tulad ng sinabi ni Mike kanina, napakahirap ng pag-collate ng mga forms, napakahirap ng mga technical requirements. And it speaks of the access of justice that indigenous women have. Humihingi ng mga IDs, kailangan ipan-notarize, kailangan dito ng pera, kailangan ng pamasahe. At lahat ito ay sinubok gawin hanggang nalaglag na ang ilang bilang ng mga maraming kababaihan na sanang gustong sumama mula sa aming partners. Dalawa ang nagpursige talaga at natulungan na makapag-file dahil medyo nagkaroon ng pagkakataon pero marami pa sana. But this speaks of how determined the indigenous women are in standing up to this government, in standing up against extractive and corporate-led development programs of this government. And so, Nora Sucal, Teresa de la Cruz, who represent the voices of the indigenous women, and LILAC as petitioners have filed this petition with the Supreme Court to call on it, to uphold their rights, our rights, to defend our rights. Sana po makinig ang Korte Suprema ngayon sa boses ng mga mamamayan at hindi sa dikta ng isang misogynist, militarist at violent na presidente doon sa Malacanang. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat.
Maraming salamat, Judy. Sa pagkakataon pong ito, malapit sa puso dahil teacher, no? Isang kabataan na humaharap laban dito sa anti-terror law. Nais ko pong tawagin si Teacher Rose. Siya po ay isang lumad community volunteer na kasama sa Saver Schools Network. Kasulukuyan yata nasa Fine Arts ngayon, ano? Nasa UP kayo, Bakwit School. Ayan, isa po yung kinahinatnan nila. Go ahead, Teacher Rose.
Yan. Isang magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Muli ako po si Rose Sayahay, isang voluntaryong guro ng isang paaralang lumad sa Mindanao. Ang Saver Schools Network po, kaisa ng iba't ibang organisasyon at ng maraming katutubo dito sa Pilipinas ay tumitindig laban sa anti-terror law na kung saan hindi pa man po naipapasa ang batas na ito ay talamak na at lantaran ang ginagawang pandarahas ng Estado sa mga lumad communities sa Mindanao. Actually po, according sa datos na nakolekta ng Saver Schools Network, aabot sa 1,030 ka-incidents ang attacks on our schools. Kabilang na po dito ang extrajudicial killings, frustrated killings, sexual harassment, ramp-up charges, indiscriminate firing, forcible closure of our schools na ngayon ay aabot na po sa 176 ang persahang pinasara ng Estado po mismo. So sobrang nakakalungkot na sa isang kagaya namin mga voluntaryong guro na walang hinahangad kundi ang mabigyan ng edukasyon ng ating mga kapatid na lumad ay binabansagang terorista. Ngayon po, tinatanong ko po ang Estado, sino ang tunay na terorista? Di ba po ang tunay na terorista ay yung tinatakot ang mga lumad at sasabihin niya mismo sa harap namin na mga lumad, umalis kayo dyan, bobombahin ko kayo. 3 taon na po ang nakakaraan, ngunit ang salita at ang pagbobomba sa mga komunidad ng katutubo ay nangyayari at patuloy po na nangyayari. Amidst lockdown po sa panahon ng pandemya, sa panahon ng krisis pangkalusugan na dapat ay primaryong tugunan ng gobyerno ay nagawa pa po nilang ipasara ang isa sa malaking lumad schools sa Mindanao, affecting around 536 lumad students. Nagawa pa po nilang harasin, no? Nagawa pa po nilang gawa ng gawa-gawang kaso, trump-up charges and fabricated charges ang ating mga teachers. Kaya naman, bilang isang voluntaryong guro at kaisa ng mga katutubo ay hindi tayo magpapagati. Hope is stronger than fear. Napatunayan na po yan nating mga Pilipino, napatunayan na po ng kasaysayan. Lalaban po kami at isa lang pong hakbang ang pag-file natin ng petition, Anti-Terror Law, no, sa pagpapakita ng ating tindig sapagkat kailanman ay hindi nagiging mali at hindi magiging mali ang pagdepensa sa lupang ninuno, ang pagtindig para sa karapatan ng mga katutubo, ang pagbigay ng edukasyon, pagdepensa sa lupa, at ang umimik para sa lahat ng ninakawan ng boses. Magandang hapon po.
Very well spoken, gaya ng isang tunay na guro. Maraming salamat, Teacher Rose. Kanina, with Ms. Quirino, pumunta tayong norte. Ngayon naman ay pupunta tayo sa sur, no? Si Teacher Chad, na ngayon ay nasa Caragaba, no? Siya po ay volunteer teacher, isang estudyante na graduado ng University of the Philippines na siya naman ngayon ay kabilang ng Alternative Learning Center for Agricultural and Livelihood Development Incorporated. Teacher Chad.
Hello, isang mapanghamong hapon sa ating lahat. Ako po si Chad, isang volunteer teacher at human rights worker sa mga komunidad ng Lumad sa Surigao del Sur. Tulad nga ng mga nabanggit, no, ng mga naunang speaker, patuloy at walang habas ang panreredtag at pagtawag sa amin ng mga guro at mga development workers sa komunidad bilang mga terorista at mga recruiter. Sa katunayan, ako personally ay walang habas na pinaparatangan ng NTF-ELCAC at ang aking mga kasamahan din ay walang habas na nireredtag. No? Ang aming Lumad School, mga paaralan ay ginawan pa ng Technical Working Group ng Regional Task Force para ipasara. At ngayon po, marami sa aming mga teacher at mga community leaders ay kumakaharap sa mga gawa-gawang kaso. Umaabot po sa 143 trump-up charges sa mga civilians dito po sa Caraga Region. No? At karamihan sa mga kinasuhan ay mga lumad leaders, mga teachers, pati na rin mga peasant organizers. At dahil nga po may trump-up charges, yung mga leaders and mga teachers, kasalukuyan naman po nagkakampo ngayon yung mga sundalo sa mga komunidad kung nasaan ang aming mga paaralan at pinaghahanap yung mga leaders and mga teachers sa amin. Tapos nagbigay din ng ultimatum yung isang paramilitary leader na ngayon ay isang IPMR, si Marcos Bocales. Sinabi niya na kung hindi kayo magso-surrender ay papakulong namin kayo. So ganun po ang nangyayari, no? So sa ilalim ng terror law, sobrang lala po nung mga ginagawa. Pati din po nagte-text, nag-update yung mga estudyante namin. Last month din, July 15, ay hinaras sila naman ng mga sundalo. May pinusasan isang 14 years old na batang lalaki. At yung mga kababaihan naman pong na mga lumad, mga estudyante ay hinaras ng mga sundalo. Tinanong sila habang nakasalubong sa daan kung nakatikim na ba daw sila, kung sila ba daw ay laspag na o maskip pa. So ganun po kabastos ang ginagawa ng mga sundalo sa kanayunan. Kaya naman po pinapanawagan talaga namin na maparayas na sila at ma-junk yung terror law. Dagdag pa niyan yung walang habas din na pambobomba sa mga komunidad. Sabay nung harassment sa mga kabataan, nung umaga na yun, July 15 din, ay naghulog ng 5 bomba. 5 hanggang 8 bomba ang mga eroplano o drone ng AFP, no. So dahil doon nag-evacuate yung 37 pamilya ng lumad sa katabing sitio dahil sa sobrang takot at sobrang traumatic po para sa mga residente, lalo na sa mga kabataan at mga may edad na. Kaya ayun po, nananawagan kami sa Supreme Court na ibasura ang terror law dahil alam namin na walang ibang target yung Estado, lalo na yung mga militar, ay kundi palayasin ng mga lumad sa komunidad, takutin sila para mapapasok na ang mga mining companies na matagal na naglalaway na makapasok kung saan naroroon ang aming mga paaralan at kung saan lumalaban ang mga mamamayang lumad. Yun po, maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat, Teacher Chad. Sa punto po ito, binubukas natin ang panel para sa ilang mga tanong. Kung meron pong nais magtanong sa ating mga kapanayam na nandito mula sa media, maaari po tayong mag-chat kung nahihiya o di kaya ay itanong lang.
Hi, good afternoon po.
Yes, Mike, please go ahead.
Sa ABS-CBN News, pasensya na, medyo mahina lang yung internet signal, but pinapakinggan ko kanina, nasabi nga ni Dean Tony La Viña and even some of the speakers na matagal na itong ginagawang red tagging against activists and rights defenders and indigenous peoples and even Muslims. Gusto ko lang malaman, base sa karanasan ninyo, paano nyo maikukumpara ang naging mga polisiya sa ilalim ng Duterte administration kumpara doon sa mga nakaraang administrasyon? Mas tumindi ba? Mas lumala ang red tagging? At gusto ko lang malaman yung konteksto kasi nung itong pagsasampa ninyo nitong petition against the Anti-Terror Law. How would you describe it? Thank you.
Sige po. Meron po tayong icon yata na raise hands, pero kung sino na ang gustong tumugon sa tanong ni Mike, feel free to do so from our panelists, please. Sino kaya? Pwede kayong kumaway-kaway para makita ko. Si Ma'am Joanna Carino, please. You have to unmute your button po. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. I am also a survivor of martial law, actually, of Marcos martial law. I was among those detained and tortured during the martial law period of Marcos. And actually, there is a feeling of deja vu that one has once you are a survivor of martial law, because so many of the extreme violations to human rights that had happened then are again happening now and in greater numbers even. No, so I mean, it's really scary. Now, even before the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act, when President Duterte came out with his Executive Order 70, and then the task force to end local communist armed conflict. In some of the fora, the military have really admitted that they have been instructed to red tag. And then they set up tarpaulins with the faces of activists. And then actually in social media, it's really, the attacks on social media is really grabe. In fact, all of them should be charged with cyber libel, but I don't know how that should be done. Because not only the activists, they're also targeting families, people by association, etc. And then now, they are readying, for instance, if the anti-terror law will really go into effect, then they will now make as communist fronts all of these democratic organizations like Cordillera People's Alliance, Tribo, Sandugo. And I think that is, wait, my cat. The big danger now is once these organizations will be, will already be proscribed as communist fronts, then what will this mean now for not only the leaders, the personalities, but our total membership? And so, I mean, I think the Duterte administration has brought the red tagging because yung mga battalions, etc., meron kasi silang humaharap dyan. I mean, talagang meron ng committees, groups na tasked to do that. So, I mean, talagang masyado ng from north to south, masyado na siya talagang very systematic na ginagawa. And like they are preparing these organizations to be charged under the Anti-Terrorism Law as communist fronts.
Thank you po. Is there anyone from our panelists?
I can answer also.
Go ahead, Dean.
Yes. From a legal point of view, Mike, this is the worst ever. Let's be very clear about that. For sure, during GMA's time, during Pinoy's time, FVR, Cory, I was engaged in all of that already as a lawyer or as a law student. The difference was, diba, ginagawa nila yan, yung red tagging, yung pagpatay ng mga aktivista, yung mga going after indigenous peoples, tagging them as terrorists even when they're just defending. Those have happened. But the scale was different. But more importantly, we all knew it was illegal. We all knew it was illegal. And they knew it was illegal. Because at least there was a very clear acknowledgement of international human rights norms, of the 1987 Constitution. Nandun yun walang legitimacy. And I would even say that in the Marcos years, although hindi naman ako ganun ka aktivista na ako sa Marcos years, but I wasn't a law person yet, and I was very young. So I can't say that I knew the law as much as I eventually got to learn it. But I did study the Marcos era laws and how it affects indigenous peoples, the Moro peoples, lalo yung Moro peoples kasi you have to remember that in 1974 there was a very big war with the MNLF, and I mean with lots of civilians were also targeted. But in the martial law years, Marcos, and I was gonna say lawyer kasi siya, but actually lawyer din si Duterte, di ba? So hindi siya, it's not because Marcos was a lawyer that in a way mas restrained sila. The only explanation I can have is na may restraint ng konti during the Marcos time was they cared about their international reputation. In a way, I mean, we always call it the U.S. Marcos dictatorship. To some extent, that helped being more restrained because there were always people in the U.S. Congress, especially Democrats, that would raise hell. In fact, even now, that's happening sa U.S. Senate, no? But the U.S. has very little influence on us. So to that extent, diba, yung the fact that it was a U.S. Marcos dictatorship meant that the U.S. was able to restrain the regime a bit more. Ito talaga, walang restraint. I mean, nakikita ko walang restraint dito. Kaya yung batas ganon, hindi na nga nila kailangan yung batas. I mean, for that, but they still do that because there's no restraint on them, except the people. And yan yung the action that we did today, which is really historic in my view, is the people, diba? The people's standing up, because that's really the only way now. I know some of us we're hoping that the International Criminal Court will act on this. That we got a very good result out of the human rights. United Nations Human Rights Council report and meeting that's been very good for human rights in the Philippines. But I don't see any restraint coming from the government even after that. May konting word, create this body to look at extrajudicial killings, etc. But it's really getting worse. So I would say without any doubt that we are in a worse situation now. Kaya pala ko sinasabi kasi August and September are protest months, diba? Recalling martial law years. Huwag na tayo magsabi never again. Kasi nandyan na tayo. And it can even be worse. In some cases, it can be worse. Certainly for extrajudicial killings, it's worse now than it was during the Marcos year.
May, ako?
Yeah. All right. Judy, after you would be Samira. But sige, since you're on now, go ahead. Then Samira.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sige, thank you. Yes, it's worse on 3 points. Isa, before may usual suspects tayo ng sino yung ire-red tag. We somehow expect na the activists, the human rights defenders are the usual suspects. But now the targets of this terror tagging have broadened. You have a disgruntled OFW talking about not receiving any ayuda and so lambasting the policy or the program of the government. Itatag na, ihaharas na. You have a student complaining about how militarist itong response sa COVID-19. Then the NBI is knocking on their doors. So the targets have broadened. And also, the platforms have diversified. So before, kaya mo i-anticipate, magpo-post sa mga walls ng mga bus terminals, ng mga waiting sheds sa simbahan. Ngayon, you have the social media where it's also being used as ano yung sabi nung isang military officer, the anti-terror law is so good that it can cover social media. So the platforms have diversified. And also the third, yung normalization in the minds of the public that it's okay to inflict violence on people we consider terrorists. And it rallies the people behind that call. With Task Force ECLAC, it rallies local communities to fight against other communities or other personalities on the ground. So yung pag-rally niya sa tao, that it's okay to attack, it's okay to harass, and to threaten so-called terrorists because I say so. Remember, anong grounds natin ng pagsabing terrorist? Sabi ni Duterte, because I say so. So how, ganun din ka-brazen itong violence. And siguro yung last point, it derives its power from, he doesn't care about kung sabi ni Attorney Dean Tony La Viña na he doesn't care about his reputation. Ito, what he cares about is yung reputation niya. He doesn't care na he would look like a killer because that's the That's the reputation that he wants to project and protect. That I'm macho, I'm a killer, I'm verdugo, and he derives power from that. And so this is a very scary, terrifying government.
Thank you, Judy. And now for Samira.
Yeah, it just reinforces yung naming, shaming, blaming. So it's worse now because of this insidious approach by which you have actually used your powers, no, as an authoritarian para po gamitin siya against others. So na-reinforce po yung othering, dinagdagan po mo po yung mga others na hindi mo kagrupo. So it actually just reinforces your blaming, shaming, and accusing, and therefore putting them behind bars so that the freedom of dissent and freedom of speech, freedom to organize ng mismo taong dinidepensa nila, yung way of life nila, at yung kanilang mga lupain, identity, ay lalo pang ma-disempower.
Thank you, Samira. In the chat, Rosé, who is a colleague at the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center, manifested that he just wants to add another point. So, Rosé, if you could come on.
Hello.
Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
I think when you compare it to the Marcos regime, the operational pretext is different. Kasi during the Marcos regime, it's about rebellion, sedition, no? And the standards were clear. With respect to the law being violated, I'm not saying there was a violation, pero the standards of the law were more or less clear. But now with the passage of the ATL, no, with its broad and perniciously ambiguous term, wala talagang standards. So in a sense, anyone can be red tagged arbitrarily by law enforcement. And with the expansive law enforcement powers under the ATL, the implications of the ATL to the lives of the communities will become worse, no? To the point that imagine, no, just living with someone suspected of being or tagged as a terrorist can make the whole family can actually can make the whole family culpable, no, for violation of the anti-terror law. Can you imagine the implication of that in the community? Diba? Parang so in terms of when you compare it to the Marcos regime, it's really different. For me, it's like red tagging on steroids. That's what's going to happen. And as it is, no? As it is, yes, there is no IRR, but the law already has a chilling effect. Diba? But it already has a chilling effect. The moment that you think about the possibility of you being prosecuted or being labeled as a terrorist for just posting something on social media, no? So before walang ganon, or hindi, it wasn't that apparent, but now you can actually feel its effects, and it's immediate already. So I mean, that's how I would describe it.
Thank you, Rosé. That's many nights us poring over how lamentable and really tragic and horrible this legislation, securitizing developments and so on. Meron pa po bang gustong sumagot? Mike, Beverly, do I hear you? Yes, go ahead.
I agree with what the other panelists mentioned earlier, no? But I just want to add yung one point, yung what makes it more intense or worse at this time. It has also crossed borders. kung dati-dati the vilification, the red tagging happens within the country. But this time we also have a very active engagement of government outside of the country, specifically with UN mechanisms and agencies. And we have seen this with some members of the military bringing in our fellow Lumads, no, indigenous peoples, to the UN in New York, and some of them were also brought in the UN in Geneva, no, to counter yung narratives that we are hearing today. Dati-dati wala yan eh. Second, even if you look, because of this grave situation now in the country, there's a strong and wide international condemnation. Pero kahit yun kasi binabaliwala na nga niya, di ba? He doesn't have any respect as far as UN human rights experts are concerned. In fact, binan na nga niya, di ba, yung pagpasok ng mga UN special rapporteurs in the country. And with the latest resolution of the High Commissioner to have to conduct an independent and impartial investigation on the human rights situation here in the Philippines, we see now a strong move even to to downplay the situation and to have that resolution not to be passed in the upcoming 45th session of the UN Human Rights Council come September. So it has worsened. I just remembered yung nabanggit ni Judy na nag-broaden yung platform sa ginagamit, etc. Even kasi yung the activities that are being targeted, especially at this time of pandemic, even humanitarian actions, if it is done by civil society, ang dali-daling sabihin ng gobyerno na these are acts of terrorism or probably an act to support support terrorists. So mas malawak, mas sistematiko, and then it has crossed borders. I cannot really speak what happened in martial law kasi kapapanganak ko pa lang doon. So but at that time na I joined, na naging aktivista ako, yun yung nakita kong difference sa ngayon.
Thank you, Beverly. May we ask again from our representatives from the media kung meron pa po ba tayong tanong at para kanino? Any other questions? From our panelists then, is there any point that you want to emphasize or perhaps add? Yes, Samira.
Yeah, it's worse again.
Sorry.
Okay. Is that okay, yung audio?
Yes, you're fine.
Yes. Again, it's worse under this administration, especially for internally displaced persons, because yung ating displacement is multiple times over. After conflict, after our migration to Manila, na clearing operations ng DILG sa lahat ng mga may pwesto na walang registry or nasa markets, and then back home po sa COVID. So there's just too many displacements under one administration, and you even have to contend even nga sa continuing offensives and operations. So at least in the other non-Marawi areas, kasi nga wala pang balik sa ground zero mga kababayan nating bakwit, no, sa ground zero. So it's really like very painful, no, the anti-terror law under this environment where you haven't even come up with a compensation package, etc., that would address those with burnt and razed homes already. And that's 3 years in the making already, 3 years na nagko-fundraising donation drive na sila sa international community. So the anti-terror law is has brought horror and uncertainty continuously with people who are further displaced by this pandemic.
Thank you, Samira. We've gone over an hour. It's 2:30. To thank you for everyone's patience. I think there is a request for a photo op where we bring up our placards, no? But before we go to that, if you would indulge me and allow me to read the closing paragraph of our petition, which LRC has also put in our briefers for the then ATB and now ATL. So let me read. Marginalized sectors such as indigenous and Moro peoples, whose participation in democratic processes ought to be secure when they defend their land and rights or manifest their dissent to policies that further marginalize them, are often met with militarization and violations. The labels terrorist and insurgents have become the catch-all pretext to legitimize attacks on them. Far from a law that protects, RA 11479 legitimizes the structural violence already perpetuated against them and is repugnant to constitutional values. Ayan po. Doon po nagtapos ang ating petition. So if we could appear on screen with our ano ba ang tawag dito? Have we evolved like on-screen placard? Ayan.
Yeah, group sharing. Group ba?
Shelly, may we request you to take the photos?
Yes. How about the others? Amira and Chad, can you please turn on your videos?
I can see
Yes.
Amira and Chad. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Ayan po. Maraming salamat sa...
Thank you.
Maraming salamat.
May panghuling pasalita ba si Dean or magpapasalamat na tayo?
Just to say na we will keep you abreast sa oral arguments and see kung pwede na physically people can be here. I don't know. Probably it will also be through Zoom or some kind of remote. I don't think we'll be going to the Supreme Court for the but we'll figure out a way to make sure na makakapag-feed tayo ng inputs dun sa maganda sana kung makapunta tayo ng court because the court can actually ask you, especially those who have experienced red tagging or harassment, can actually ask you directly. So medyo dramatic yon. But I guess in this instance that will not happen. But we'll see. We'll attend the meetings once it's called. We expect the consolidation to happen by Tuesday next week. Although because may dalawa pang petitions from Mindanao, they might wait for that and wait another week before consolidating everyone. So we will see. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.